Don't touch my car. The billionaire's voice cut through the morning air with the kind of authority that had commanded boardrooms and bent industries to his will, but standing there in the industrial district, watching smoke pour from his $4.2 million Quantum Apex hypercar, Anthony Wright's commanding tone carried something else entirely. Desperation. The homeless black man approaching him didn't flinch. His hands were raised slightly, a universal gesture of peace, but his eyes held something Anthony couldn't quite place. Knowledge, confidence, something that didn't match the worn clothes and unkempt beard. "Sir," the man said, his voice steady and professional, "your quantum thrust cooling system has a microfracture in the secondary loop." He paused, meeting Anthony's skeptical gaze directly. "I can fix it." Anthony's finger hovered over the security number on his phone. His mind raced through impossible questions. How could this homeless man possibly know about technology so classified that even the manufacturer wouldn't acknowledge it existed? What hidden genius was standing before him in tattered clothes and scuffed shoes? And why was someone with this knowledge living on the streets? The crowd was growing. Phones were pointed at the smoking hypercar, at the tech titan's public humiliation, at what would surely become viral content within minutes. Anthony Wright, founder of Nexus Innovations, self-made billionaire, tech wonderkind, stranded with his multimillion-dollar status symbol dying in front of him. In the next 60 seconds, everything Anthony believed about talent, worth, and judgment would shatter completely. Before we go deeper into this story, take a second and hit that subscribe button, give this video a like, and let us know where you're watching from. I'm curious to know how far these stories travel. Thomas Johnson hadn't always lived on the streets. 3 years ago, his name had appeared on patents that transformed aerospace, technology, and saved countless lives. 3 years ago, he'd commanded a six-figure salary, presented at international conferences, and been recognized as one of the brightest minds in thermal engineering. 3 years ago, Thomas Johnson had been somebody. Now he slept under the open sky, an invisible man to the same tech executives who rushed past him every morning without so much as a glance. The morning had started like any other. Thomas woke at dawn in his carefully hidden spot behind the abandoned machine shop near Tech Row. The location was strategic, close enough to the public facilities he needed, far enough from foot traffic to avoid being moved along by security or police. He folded his weathered tarp with military precision, a habit ingrained from his engineering days when precision meant the difference between success and catastrophic failure. His routine was methodical, almost ritualistic. Wash up at the public restroom 3 blocks east. Brush teeth with supplies, carefully rationed to last the month. Head to the library the moment it opened its doors at 9. Knowledge remained his one unshakable connection to his former life, the single thread that tethered him to who he had been before everything fell apart. Thomas had been watching that distinctive Quantum Apex for weeks now. These rare hypercars, only 17 ever manufactured, occasionally glided through the neighborhood on their way to the exclusive tech campus across the city. He recognized the engine's unique purr the way a musician recognizes a perfect chord. He should, considering he'd helped design its predecessor during his brief but brilliant consultancy at Aerotech Industries before everything fell apart. MIT graduate, 3 engineering degrees earned with highest honors, holder of 7 patents that had generated millions upon millions of dollars for companies that no longer acknowledged his existence. The irony wasn't lost on Thomas that he could recite complex thermodynamic equations from memory but couldn't get past a hiring manager's prejudiced gaze long enough to prove his worth. Overqualified, they said, when they bothered to interview him at all. Not a cultural fit, they muttered when his credentials couldn't be denied, when the facts on his resume demanded at least a conversation. The real reasons hung unspoken in the sterile air of those brief, uncomfortable meetings. A black man from the wrong side of town, no permanent address to list on applications. The gap in his employment history following the false accusations that had destroyed his career and nearly destroyed his spirit. But Thomas maintained his dignity despite it all. He volunteered teaching science to children at the homeless shelter 3 nights a week, watching young eyes light up with wonder when they understood Newton's laws or grasped the elegant simplicity of chemical bonds. He read discarded tech journals found in recycling bins outside company headquarters, keeping his mind sharp despite living in a system seemingly designed to dull it. He survived. He persisted. He refused to let circumstances define his worth, even when the world insisted they did. This particular morning, Thomas had noticed something wrong with the hypercar before it even pulled to the curb. The sound was off, a subtle irregularity in the engine's rhythm that only someone intimately familiar with its design would recognize. The microfracture was developing in the exact spot the original blueprints had predicted weakness, a vulnerability that Thomas himself had flagged in his consultation report years ago. His warnings had been brushed aside by executives eager to meet production deadlines, more concerned with quarterly earnings than long-term structural integrity. Now, one of those very executives stood helplessly before a smoking multi-million-dollar testament to Thomas's ignored expertise. Thomas approached cautiously, each step measured and deliberate. He'd learned the hard way that his help wasn't always welcome, especially from those who judged books by their covers before reading a single page. His worn clothes and unkempt beard typically triggered security calls faster than his engineering insights triggered respect or recognition. He saw it flicker in Anthony Wright's eyes, not recognition of Thomas as a person, not even recognition of Thomas as a fellow human being struggling through life, but recognition of Thomas as a threat. The billionaire's hand tightened around his phone, knuckles whitening slightly. Thomas knew that gesture intimately. He'd seen it countless times over the past 3 years, that instinctive protective clutch, that preparation to call for help against perceived danger. What Anthony couldn't possibly know was that Thomas had once been invited to present at the same prestigious tech conferences where Anthony himself had been a keynote speaker. Their paths had nearly crossed 5 years ago, back when Thomas still had a career, a reputation, a future. That was before his life imploded over accusations later proven completely false. But not before his reputation was irreparably damaged, not before the whisper network of Silicon Valley had labeled him unemployable. The tech world, Thomas had learned, had a remarkably short memory for vindication, but an elephantine memory for scandal. Thomas watched the smoke pattern emanating from the hypercar's engine with the analytical eye of someone who had spent decades studying such things. The color, that specific shade of blue-gray, the density, the way it dispersed in the morning air. Each detail told him exactly which components were failing, precisely why, and most importantly, how to fix it. He could solve this problem. With basic tools and knowledge that apparently hadn't reached the current generation of engineers, he could have this hypercar running perfectly in under 15 minutes. Something compelled him forward, despite knowing the likely reception. Maybe it was professional pride, that deep-seated need to prove that his skills hadn't atrophied on the streets. Maybe it was the rare opportunity to prove his worth to someone who mattered in the industry that had cast him aside. Or maybe it was simply that Thomas Johnson, despite everything life had systematically thrown at him, remained a problem solver at his very core. Anthony Wright had just ended another fruitless call when Thomas stepped forward. The billionaire's frustration was evident in every tense line of his body, in the way he ran his hand through his expensive haircut, in the desperate glances he kept shooting at his smoking investment. The gathering crowd whispered and pointed, phones recording every moment of the tech billionaire's very public humiliation. Anthony Wright's reputation was on the line as much as his multi-million-dollar hypercar. Thomas took a deep breath, straightened his shoulders despite the weight of 3 years' worth of rejection, and stepped forward into Anthony's line of sight. "Sir, I know what's wrong with your car," he said, keeping his voice steady and professional despite the way his heart hammered against his ribs. "Your quantum thrust cooling system has a micro-fracture in the secondary loop." The words that came next would set in motion a chain of events that would change both their lives forever. Little did either man know that this chance encounter would expose not just a flaw in a luxury car, but a fundamental flaw in the very system that determined who deserved a second chance and who didn't. Anthony Wright's day was imploding as spectacularly as his hypercar's cooling system. The Quantum Apex, one of only 17 ever manufactured, a vehicle that cost more than most people would earn in a lifetime, had chosen the absolute worst possible moment to break down, 3 hours before his critical presentation to potential investors. 2 miles from the nearest authorized service point, 0 cell reception that actually worked in this industrial wasteland. "Step back from the vehicle, please," Anthony said, not even looking Thomas in the eye. His voice carried that practiced authority of someone who'd spent his entire adult life being obeyed without question. Someone whose commands had never been challenged. Someone who'd never had to consider that he might be wrong. The crowd of onlookers had doubled in size. Phone cameras pointed at the spectacle from every conceivable angle. Anthony Wright, tech wunderkind, founder of Nexus Innovations, self-made billionaire, stranded alongside his $4.2 million status symbol. This would be trending on Twitter within minutes. The headlines were already writing themselves in his mind. Tech billionaire's fancy car breaks down. Wright's wrong day. The mockery would be endless. "Sir, I really can help," Thomas persisted, maintaining a respectful distance but refusing to back away, refusing to make himself invisible the way society had trained him to do. "That specific model has a known issue with the quantum thrust cooling system, particularly in the secondary loop," How would you know anything about this car? Anthony cut him off, finally looking directly at Thomas for the first time. His gaze took in everything with brutal efficiency: the worn clothes that had seen too many winters, the unkempt appearance that spoke of limited access to proper facilities, the reusable grocery bag that appeared to contain Thomas's entire worldly possessions. His expression shifted from frustration to dismissal in a single devastating instant. Thomas met his gaze steadily, unflinching. He'd endured worse than skeptical looks. Because I helped design the prototype cooling system it's based on. A burst of laughter escaped Anthony's lips, sharp, incredulous, cutting through the morning air like a blade. Several onlookers joined in nervously, unsure what they were witnessing but sensing the tension, the power dynamic, the cruelty of the moment. "Right," Anthony said, his voice dripping with sarcasm, "and I'm teaching rocket science at community college on weekends." He turned away, dismissing Thomas as completely as if the man had ceased to exist, focusing once again on his phone that stubbornly refused to find signal. "Look," Anthony continued, not even bothering to face him, "I appreciate you trying to, whatever this is, but this vehicle contains proprietary technology. Even most professional mechanics can't service it." Thomas didn't move. His voice remained calm, carrying that specific technical precision that came from real knowledge, not internet research or lucky guesses. "The fracture is causing coolant to leak into the tertiary chamber," he said. "That's why you're getting that specific shade of blue-gray smoke instead of black or white. In approximately 8 minutes, the leak will reach the primary thermal core. At that point, the damage becomes irreversible. Your $4.2 million car will be reduced to $4.2 million worth of exotic scrap metal." Something in Thomas's tone, the absolute confidence, the technical specificity, the complete lack of hesitation or doubt, made Anthony pause mid-dial. He turned back slowly, studying Thomas with new eyes, really seeing him for perhaps the first time as something other than an inconvenient nuisance. "8 minutes," Thomas repeated quietly. "I can fix it in 6 with what I have in my bag and some improvised materials from your emergency kit. Or you can wait for your authorized technician to arrive, assuming you can reach them, assuming they can get here in time, assuming they can even diagnose the problem, and explain to your investors why you're arriving in an Uber." The crowd had gone silent now, sensing the shift in dynamic, the strange power reversal happening before their eyes. Several people had stopped recording, too absorbed in the unfolding drama to remember their phones. Anthony's jaw tightened. Everything in his privileged upbringing, everything in his elite business education, everything in his carefully curated social circle told him to ignore this man, to wait for proper help, to maintain the boundaries that existed for good reason. Society had rules, hierarchies, order, but another part of him, the part that had built a billion-dollar company by recognizing patterns others missed, by taking calculated risks that others feared, by trusting his instincts when logic argued otherwise, was screaming at him to pay attention. That screaming was getting louder with each passing second. "You said you helped design the prototype," Anthony said carefully, his tone shifting from dismissive to cautious. "For who?" "Aerotech Industries," Thomas replied without hesitation. 5 years ago, the quantum thrust cooling system that eventually became commercialized for your vehicle was derived from my aerospace application patents, specifically patents 7,824-619 and 7,954-337. You can verify that if you have cell reception, which I'm guessing you don't right now. Anthony's mind raced. Those patent numbers sounded legitimate, specific enough to be real, technical enough to be verifiable. But how could this homeless man possibly— "7 minutes now," Thomas said quietly, glancing at the smoke pattern with the practiced eye of an expert. "Your choice, sir. Let me help, or watch your investment become a very expensive paperweight, but decide quickly. Time's running out." Anthony Wright had built his fortune on reading people, on understanding patterns that others missed, on knowing when to trust his instincts, even when logic argued otherwise. Right now, every logical fiber in his being told him this was insane, this was reckless, this was a liability nightmare waiting to happen. But his instincts, those same instincts that had made him a billionaire before 40, that had guided every major decision of his career, were screaming something entirely different. "Fine," he said, the word coming out sharp and reluctant. "But if you damage anything further, I'm calling the police. Understood?" Understood, Thomas replied simply, no triumph in his voice, no smugness, just quiet professionalism. He set down his worn grocery bag carefully and knelt beside the hypercar with a reverence that surprised Anthony. This wasn't the fumbling uncertainty of someone in over their head, desperately hoping to pull off a miracle. This was the careful, precise movement of someone who knew exactly what they were doing, who had done this 1,000 times before in 1,000 different contexts. "I need a pencil," Thomas said, looking up at the crowd of onlookers. "A standard number 2 pencil, and that emergency road kit in your trunk, it should contain sealant compound." Anthony retrieved the items, his hands shaking slightly, wondering if he'd just made the biggest mistake of his day or the most important decision of his life. The crowd pressed closer, phones still recording, but the energy had shifted from mockery to genuine anticipation. Thomas accepted the materials without comment and popped open the hood with a gesture so casual, so familiar, it seemed impossible he'd never seen this specific vehicle before. What Anthony saw next left him absolutely speechless. Thomas's hands moved with surgical precision through the Quantum Apex's impossibly complex engine system, navigating maze-like assemblies as if he'd designed every component himself, which Anthony was beginning to suspect maybe he had. His fingers traced cooling lines with the confidence of intimate knowledge, identified components with barely a glance, diagnosed problems with a speed that defied comprehension. "The microfracture here," Thomas explained as he worked, his voice taking on the measured tone of a professor mid-lecture, someone who'd spent years teaching complex concepts to students who struggled to keep up, "creates a pressure differential that forces coolant into the tertiary chamber. Standard repair protocol would require replacing the entire loop assembly at the factory, about $30,000 in parts and labor, 3 days of specialized work." He crushed the pencil lead into fine powder with practiced efficiency, mixing it carefully with the emergency sealant in proportions that seemed random but clearly weren't. Graphite nanoparticles create a molecular bond with the polymer base of this sealant. When applied to the fracture point at precisely 147 degrees Celsius, which happens to be the current temperature of this particular component, they form a temporary seal that's actually stronger than the original factory welding. Anthony watched, transfixed, as Thomas applied the mixture with the confidence of someone who had performed this exact repair countless times, even though Anthony knew that this specific solution had never been documented anywhere, had never been approved by any manufacturer, had never existed until this very moment when a homeless genius created it from nothing. The smoke began to thin almost immediately, dissipating into the morning air like a bad dream fading in daylight. "This will hold for approximately 300 miles, Thomas continued, his hands still moving with mechanical precision, making minute adjustments that Anthony couldn't even follow, "long enough for you to reach proper facilities for a permanent repair. But I'd strongly recommend replacing the entire secondary loop assembly within 48 hours. The fracture will continue to spread eventually. It's a fundamental design flaw in the original engineering that I flagged 5 years ago in my consultation report to Aerotech." He closed the hood with a satisfying click and stood, wiping his hands on his worn jeans, meeting Anthony's stunned gaze with quiet dignity. "You can start her up now," Thomas said. "Should run perfectly. Check your thermal readouts. Everything should be in the green." Anthony fumbled with his key fob, his hands suddenly clumsy with shock and disbelief. The engine purred to life immediately, smooth as silk, powerful and precise. No smoke, no warning lights, no indication that anything had ever been wrong. The dashboard display showed all systems optimal, thermal regulation perfect, every parameter exactly where it should be. The crowd erupted in applause and cheers. Several people rushed forward with questions, with praise, with exclamations of amazement and disbelief. A few asked for Thomas's contact information, his business card, his website, but Anthony barely heard any of it. He was staring at Thomas Johnson with a mixture of disbelief, shame, and dawning realization that was shaking him to his very core, forcing him to confront assumptions he hadn't even known he was making. "Who are you?" Anthony asked quietly, the question carrying far more weight than its 3 simple words suggested. "Really, who are you?" Thomas gave him a small, sad smile that held years of disappointment and dignity in equal measure. "Someone who used to be somebody," he said softly, "and someone who's been trying to become somebody again ever since. If you were in Thomas's position right now, having just proven your brilliance to someone who dismissed you on sight, what would you be feeling? Would it be triumph, vindication, or something more complicated? Share your thoughts in the comments below." "Thomas Johnson," the homeless man said, extending a hand that bore the calluses of street living, but moved with the practiced grace of someone who'd once commanded respect in boardrooms and laboratories. "MIT class of 2015? 3 engineering degrees with highest honors, 7 patents in aerospace thermal dynamics and quantum cooling systems, former senior consultant at Aerotech Industries until circumstances beyond my control made me unemployable in the only industry I'd ever known. Anthony shook his hand automatically, his mind still reeling from what he'd just witnessed. This couldn't be real. People like this didn't end up on the streets. The system didn't fail genius this spectacularly, this completely, this invisibly, except looking at Thomas, really looking at him for the first time. Anthony realized that perhaps the system failed exactly this spectacularly, this routinely, this invisibly every single day, and people like him simply never noticed. "I don't understand," Anthony said, his voice carrying genuine confusion and the first hints of shame. "How does someone with your credentials, with your obvious expertise, end up—" He gestured vaguely, unable to complete the sentence, unable to voice the obvious. "Homeless," Thomas finished for him, his tone gentle but unflinching. "The word isn't shameful, Mr. Wright. The circumstances that create homelessness are shameful. The systems that perpetuate it are shameful. But the word itself is just a descriptor of reality. And I have learned that refusing to name reality doesn't change it." The crowd was beginning to disperse now that the immediate entertainment was over. But a few people lingered at the edges, sensing that something significant was unfolding, something more important than a fixed car. 3 years ago, Thomas began, his voice steady despite the pain Anthony could hear beneath every word, I was accused of stealing proprietary information from Aerotech. The accusation was false, provably, demonstrably false. But by the time the 6-month investigation cleared me completely, my reputation was destroyed. The tech industry has a remarkably efficient whisper network, Mr. Wright. Once you're labeled as untrustworthy, once your name is connected to scandal, even scandal that's later disproven, no amount of evidence to the contrary matters. The stain remains. He shifted his grocery bag to his other hand, a small gesture that spoke volumes about the constant weight he carried, both physical and metaphorical. I lost my apartment first, couldn't make rent without income, and the investigation meant I was suspended without pay. Lost my car second when I couldn't keep up the payments. Lost my professional network third because people stopped answering my calls, stopped replying to my emails, stopped seeing me as human once I didn't have a prestigious job title or company affiliation attached to my name. Anthony felt something cold and uncomfortable settle in his stomach, a growing awareness of complicity in a system he'd never questioned. But surely someone, Anthony started. "Surely someone what?" Thomas interrupted gently, not unkindly. "Surely someone gave me a chance. Surely someone looked past the circumstances to see my capabilities. I applied to 237 positions in my first 6 months of unemployment, Mr. Wright. 237. I received callbacks for 11. 3, actually. Interviewed me, 0 made offers." He paused, letting those numbers sink in, letting Anthony understand the systematic nature of his exclusion. "Do you know what happens when you don't have an address, Mr. Wright? When you can't list a permanent residence on job applications, you can't fill out the forms properly, you can't receive confirmation emails or interview notifications, you can't show up looking presentable because you don't have access to proper facilities for showering, for maintaining professional appearance, for the 1,000 small things that signal employability to hiring managers." Thomas's voice grew more passionate despite his obvious effort to maintain composure. "The very systems designed to help people find employment, the application portals, the background check services, the professional networking platforms, all of them systematically exclude the people who need help most desperately. It's not a bug in the system, it's a feature. The system is working exactly as designed to keep people like me invisible." "But your skills," Anthony protested weakly, gesturing toward the now perfectly running hypercar, "you just demonstrated abilities that most professional engineers don't have. My skills mean nothing if no one will look past my appearance long enough to assess them," Thomas said simply, the words landing with devastating honesty. "You just experienced that yourself, Mr. Wright. You saw a homeless black man approaching your expensive car. And your first instinct wasn't curiosity or openness. It was fear. It was dismissal. Your hand went to your phone to call security, not to ask if I needed help, not to wonder about my circumstances or my story. Your instinct was to make me go away." The words landed like physical blows because they were utterly, devastatingly true. Anthony had no defense, no justification, no excuse that wouldn't sound hollow and self-serving in the face of Thomas's quiet truth. Anthony started then, stopped, unsure what he could possibly say. "You're not unusual," Thomas continued, his tone more compassionate than accusing. "You're doing exactly what society has taught you to do, what all of us are conditioned to do from birth. We judge quickly, we categorize, we create hierarchies of worth based on visible markers of success. We tell ourselves it's practical, that we don't have time to investigate every person we encounter, that surface judgments are necessary for efficiency." He looked directly at Anthony. "But the cost of that efficiency is human potential. It's brilliance wasted. It's solutions to problems going undiscovered. It's innovations that could change the world dying on the streets because the people who could create them can't get past the first filter of judgment." Before we continue, take a second and share your thoughts so far on this story below. I read every single one. Have you ever misjudged someone based on appearance, or been misjudged yourself? This happens more than we realize. Anthony Wright stood in the industrial district beside his now perfectly running 4.2 million hypercar and felt the entire foundation of his worldview cracking like thin ice beneath sudden weight. Everything he thought he knew about merit, about worth, about the natural order of success and failure, about who deserved opportunity and who didn't, all of it was revealing itself as comfortable fiction, carefully constructed lies that allowed him to sleep peacefully at night. "I need to verify the repair holds," he said abruptly, the words coming out before he'd fully formed the thought. "Would you ride with me to my office? I want to make sure everything's stable and He paused, searching for words that wouldn't sound patronizing or hollow or like the guilt-driven charity Thomas had already experienced too many times. "I'd like to hear more about your story if you're willing to share it." Thomas studied him for a long moment, those intelligent eyes seeming to weigh Anthony's sincerity against a lifetime of broken promises and false hope, against 3 years of well-meaning people who said they wanted to help but disappeared the moment helping became inconvenient. Finally, Thomas nodded slowly. "All right, Mr. Wright, I'll ride with you." As Thomas settled into the passenger seat, Italian leather worth more than most people's monthly salaries, Anthony noticed the care he took with his movements. The way he carefully arranged his grocery bag to avoid dirtying the pristine interior, the way he sat with perfect posture despite obvious physical exhaustion, the way he touched nothing unnecessarily, making himself as small and unobtrusive as possible. There was dignity in every gesture, a refusal to be diminished by circumstances, a quiet insistence on maintaining self-respect when the world offered none. Anthony pulled onto the street, the hypercar responding beautifully to his commands, Thomas's impossible repair holding perfectly. The engine's purr was smooth and precise, exactly as it should be, as if nothing had ever been wrong. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken questions and uncomfortable truths. "You said you volunteer at a shelter," Anthony began, breaking the quiet. "Teaching science to kids." "3 nights a week," Thomas confirmed, watching the city slide past the window with eyes that saw things Anthony had never noticed. The other homeless people in doorways, the subtle hierarchies of street survival, the invisible infrastructure of poverty that existed parallel to the gleaming tech campuses and luxury condos. Kids from the neighborhood mostly, many of them are dealing with circumstances that would break most adults: poverty, unstable housing, food insecurity, family situations that no child should have to navigate. He turned slightly toward Anthony. "But when you show them how chemistry works, when you demonstrate physics principles with everyday objects, when you let them understand that the universe follows rules they can learn and predict and even manipulate, you see something light up inside them. Hope, maybe, or just the realization that knowledge is power they can actually access, that their circumstances don't have to define their potential." "That's remarkable," Anthony said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. "It's necessary," Thomas corrected gently. "These kids are told constantly, explicitly and implicitly, what they can't do, who they can't become, what dreams are unrealistic for people like them. Education is sometimes the only weapon they have against systemic inequality. Knowledge is the only currency that can't be repossessed or foreclosed on." Anthony navigated through morning traffic, his mind desperately trying to process this information, to reconcile the brilliant, compassionate, articulate man sitting beside him with every prejudiced assumption he'd unconsciously carried about homelessness, about poverty, about who deserved success, and who was simply reaping what they'd sown. "The accusations against you," Anthony said carefully after several blocks of silence. "You mentioned they were proven false. What exactly happened?" Thomas was quiet for a moment, his expression distant, reliving memories that clearly still caused pain. "A colleague at Aerotech wanted credit for a patent I'd developed," he finally said. "The quantum thrust cooling system, the very technology that's now in this car you're driving, was mine. Every calculation, every design iteration, every innovation. But he had connections, seniority, political savvy. He accused me of stealing his work, of planning to sell it to competitors, of being a security risk to the company. His voice remained level, controlled, but Anthony could hear the pain beneath it like bedrock beneath topsoil. The investigation took 6 months. During that time, I was suspended without pay, my access to facilities revoked, my name dragged through every tech publication and industry forum. Colleagues I'd considered friends stopped responding to messages. My reputation, the thing I'd spent my entire career building, was demolished in weeks. When they finally cleared me, when they found email chains and development logs and witness testimonies that proved conclusively the work was mine, that the accusations were baseless, the damage was already irreversibly done. The colleague who made the false accusations faced a written reprimand. I faced professional extinction. That's unconscionable, Anthony said, feeling anger on Thomas's behalf, but also growing awareness of his own complicity in systems that allowed such injustice. That's the tech industry, Thomas said simply. Innovation is supposed to be meritocratic, purely about ideas and execution and results, but it's as subject to politics, bias, and power dynamics as any other field. More so, perhaps, because we tell ourselves we're better than that. We convince ourselves that our success is purely merit-based, that we've earned everything through talent and hard work alone, that the system rewards the best and brightest fairly. He looked at Anthony. It makes it easy to dismiss those who fail as simply not good enough, not smart enough, not driven enough. If success is purely about merit, then failure must be purely about lack of merit. It's a comfortable lie that absolves us of responsibility for systemic injustice. Anthony's hands tightened on the steering wheel. How many times had he thought exactly that? How many times had he looked at someone struggling and assumed they simply hadn't worked hard enough, hadn't been smart enough, hadn't wanted success badly enough? They were approaching the gleaming headquarters of Nexus Innovations now, its modern architecture rising against the skyline like a temple to technological achievement and human ambition. Anthony had always felt pride seeing it, a surge of satisfaction knowing he'd built this empire from nothing but ideas and determination. Now, looking at it through Thomas's eyes, he wondered how many brilliant minds had been turned away at its doors because they didn't fit the expected profile of genius. How many Thomas Johnsons had his own hiring managers dismissed without a second thought? "Mr. Wright," Thomas said as they pulled into the executive parking area, "I appreciate the ride, and I'm genuinely glad I could help with your car, but I should be clear about something before we go any further." Anthony put the car in park and turned to face him. "I didn't fix your vehicle hoping for charity or rescue," Thomas continued. "I did it because I saw a problem I could solve, because my knowledge has value regardless of my current circumstances, and because—" he paused, choosing his words with obvious care, "because I'm still an engineer at heart. Problems demand solutions. It's that simple for me. It's not about gratitude or owing anyone or seeking validation from the people who rejected me." Anthony took a deep breath. "What if I don't want to offer charity?" he said. "What if I want to offer you an opportunity, a real one, not some patronizing rescue mission motivated by guilt? Your skills just saved my car using materials that shouldn't have worked according to any engineering manual. You identified a problem that the manufacturer's own engineers couldn't diagnose remotely. You designed the foundational technology my company's quantum systems rely upon." He held Thomas's gaze. "Come inside, meet my team, let them see what you can do. And then, if they're as impressed as I am, and I guarantee they will be, let's talk about what comes next." Thomas searched his face for a long moment, looking for false promises or pitying condescension, or the hollow enthusiasm of someone who would lose interest once the initial novelty wore off. Whatever he found there must have satisfied him because he nodded slowly. "All right," Thomas said. "But, Mr. Wright, if you're doing this just to feel better about yourself, just to ease some momentary guilt that will fade by tomorrow morning, we should end this right now. I can't afford to invest hope in another false start. I've learned the hard way that well-meaning promises from powerful people often evaporate when reality proves inconvenient or uncomfortable." "This isn't about my feelings," Anthony said, meeting Thomas's gaze directly. "This is about recognizing talent I almost missed and making sure my company doesn't make that mistake again. I built Nexus Innovations by finding the best minds available. Today I learned I've been looking in entirely the wrong places." They walked through the lobby together, and Anthony watched his employees' reactions with newly opened eyes, the double takes as people processed the incongruity of their CEO. walking beside someone who looked so obviously out of place in their polished corporate world, the whispered conversations that started the moment they passed. The subtle shifts in body language as people unconsciously created distance. How many times had similar scenes played out? How many times had someone brilliant been dismissed, feared, or ignored simply because their exterior didn't match expectations? Thomas, this is Sophia Reyes, our Chief Technology Officer, Anthony said, as an elegant woman in her 50s approached them with curious eyes. Sophia, meet Thomas Johnson. Recognition flashed in Sophia's eyes immediately, not of Thomas the person, but of Thomas the name, the reputation from before everything fell apart. The Thomas Johnson from Aerotech, she asked, genuine admiration evident in her voice. The quantum thermal regulation pioneer. Thomas nodded politely with quiet dignity. A lifetime ago, it seems. Your work was revolutionary, Sophia said, and Anthony could tell she meant it authentically. We've built upon your foundation for our new quantum computing systems. The cooling architecture you developed made our current generation of processors possible. I've referenced your patents dozens of times in my own research. That's exactly why he's here, Anthony explained. Thomas just saved my quantum apex with an improvised repair that the manufacturer claimed was impossible outside their specialized facility, used pencil lead and emergency sealant to fix a microfracture in the secondary cooling loop. Sophia's eyes widened in genuine shock and delight. You fixed the secondary cooling loop issue in the field. With what equipment? Graphite nanoparticles and polymer-based sealant, Thomas replied calmly, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. Basic materials chemistry, really, once you understand the underlying thermal dynamics and molecular bonding principles? Sophia stared at him for a moment, then burst into delighted laughter. That's absolutely brilliant. The graphite nanoparticles would create exactly the right molecular bond with the polymer base. The temporary seal would actually be stronger than the original welding at the fracture point. Why didn't we think of that? Sometimes the simplest solutions are overlooked when you're too close to a problem, Thomas suggested diplomatically. Fresh perspective can be valuable, especially from someone who has the time to think without the pressure of quarterly deadlines and production schedules. Anthony checked his watch. 20 minutes until the investor meeting. The investors are gathering in the main conference room. Shall we? As they entered the conference room, conversations quieted immediately. A dozen impeccably dressed investors turned to assess the newcomer, and Anthony saw their expressions shift through a predictable progression as they processed Thomas's appearance. Curiosity, confusion, in a few cases, barely disguised disdain. This was the moment, Anthony realized. The moment where he could take the easy path, introduce Thomas, carefully, cushion his presence with lengthy explanations and justifications, make the investors comfortable with this deviation from their expected reality. Or he could do something different, something that actually mattered, something that challenged the very assumptions this room was built upon. Anthony stepped forward confidently, his decision made. Ladies and gentlemen, before we begin our scheduled presentation, I'd like to introduce a special guest. He gestured toward Thomas. This is Thomas Johnson, the original inventor of the quantum thrust cooling system that revolutionized aerospace engineering 5 years ago, and the man who just saved my supposedly unrepairable hypercar with materials costing less than $20 and knowledge that apparently hasn't reached the current generation of engineers. He paused, letting that sink in, watching faces shift from confusion to dawning interest. The implications of what we've discovered this morning go far beyond a single car repair. What you're about to witness will fundamentally change how we think about talent, innovation, and the potential we're systematically overlooking every single day. The presentation began with Nexus Innovations team showcasing their new thermal regulation system for quantum computing, cutting-edge design representing millions in research and development. Complex diagrams filled the screens. Technical specifications scrolled past. The investors nodded appreciatively, asking pointed questions about scalability, manufacturing costs, market penetration. Thomas listened attentively from his seat, occasionally making notes on the pad provided. Anthony watched him from across the room, seeing the subtle shifts in his expression, the slight frown at one particular thermal junction design, the barely perceptible nod at an elegant solution to heat dissipation, the thoughtful pause when the cost projections appeared on screen. When the presentation concluded and the floor opened for discussion, Anthony turned to Thomas. Thomas, you've been studying this design for the past hour. I'd value your professional perspective. The room went silent. Several investors exchanged glances, some curious, some skeptical. one or two clearly annoyed at this deviation from standard protocol. Thomas stood slowly, moving to the presentation screen with that same quiet confidence Anthony had witnessed beside the broken-down hypercar. "Thank you for the opportunity to comment," he began, his voice carrying the natural authority of genuine expertise rather than borrowed credentials or corporate hierarchy. "Your system is impressive and represents significant advancement in the field. The integration between quantum processing and thermal management is elegant." He paused. "However, I've identified three critical flaws in the current design that, if left unaddressed, will create catastrophic failures within 18 months of full-scale deployment." The room erupted in murmurs. The lead engineer, a man named David Chen, who'd spent 3 years developing this system, looked visibly affronted. "With all due respect," David began, his voice tight, "we've tested this system exhaustively. The thermal junction at point 7C, Thomas interrupted gently but firmly, pointing to a specific location on the screen. "It's positioned 3 millimeters too close to the quantum processing core. At operational temperatures, the thermal expansion coefficient of the materials you've selected will create microscopic stress fractures within 16 to 18 months of continuous operation. The fractures will propagate through the secondary cooling loop, causing cascade failure that will destroy the entire processing array." He moved to another section of the display. "Here, the coolant flow rate is optimized for maximum efficiency at standard operating temperatures, but you haven't accounted for quantum decoherence spikes that occur during heavy computational loads. When those spikes happen, and they will happen regularly under real-world usage, your cooling system will experience momentary lag that allows critical components to exceed safe temperature thresholds by margins that will cause permanent damage." Thomas was fully in his element now, his expertise undeniable, his analysis precise and devastating in its implications. "And finally, this material selection for the primary heat sink, titanium-aluminum alloy. It's cost-effective, I understand the economic reasoning, but it's insufficiently conductive for the heat loads your system will generate at full scale. You'll see degraded performance within 6 months, complete thermal failure within 14. He turned to face the room full of investors, meeting their shocked gazes calmly. "These aren't theoretical concerns based on speculation. I've seen these exact failure modes in aerospace applications where the cost of failure is measured in lives, not just dollars. I've documented them extensively in my patent filings, and I can show you the mathematical models and empirical data that proves every single one of these predictions." The room remained silent, but it was a different silence now, the silence of people reassessing their assumptions, recalculating their certainties, confronting the uncomfortable reality that they'd almost invested millions in a fundamentally flawed system. "Before we go deeper, I would love to hear your point of view. If you were one of those investors watching Thomas dismantle a multi-million-dollar design while homeless, what would be going through your mind? Share your thoughts in the comments." "Can they be fixed?" asked Patricia Chen, an investor who had made her fortune in semiconductor manufacturing and knew genuine expertise when she heard it. "Not only can they be fixed," Thomas replied with quiet confidence, "but the solutions are elegant and will actually reduce your manufacturing costs while simultaneously improving performance by margins that will put you years ahead of your competition." He returned to the presentation screen, and for the next 7 minutes, Thomas Johnson, homeless 3 hours ago, invisible to the world that created him, transformed Nexus Innovations' quantum thermal regulation system with modifications so brilliant, so elegant, so obviously correct in retrospect that the entire room sat transfixed in absolute silence. When he finished, the silence stretched for 3 full seconds before Patricia started clapping. Others joined immediately, the applause building until the entire room was on their feet, a standing ovation for brilliance that had nearly been dismissed, nearly been lost, nearly been wasted on the streets. "That was extraordinary," Patricia said, approaching Thomas directly, her expression combining respect and shame in equal measure. "Absolutely extraordinary. What did you say your current position at Nexus was?" "I don't have one," Thomas replied with simple honesty. "I'm homeless, Ms. Chen. I met Mr. Wright approximately 4 hours ago when his car broke down in the industrial district where I typically spend my mornings. This is the first time I've been inside a corporate office in 3 years. The room froze, but this time the silence carried different quality: shock, confusion, and in several faces dawning shame at assumptions they'd been making throughout his entire presentation. 2 hours later, after the last investors filed out, all having committed to significantly increased funding, several having specifically requested Thomas's continued involvement in the project, Anthony closed the conference room door and turned to face the man who had just revolutionized his company's flagship product. "That was extraordinary," Anthony said, his voice thick with emotion. You didn't just improve our design, you transformed it completely. Sophia says your modifications will put us 3 to 5 years ahead of our nearest competitor. Thomas nodded modestly, gathering his notes with the same meticulous care he'd shown throughout. Your team laid a solid foundation. I merely built upon their excellent work. That's what collaboration should be. Different perspectives and experiences creating something better than any individual could achieve alone. Anthony sat across from him, feeling the full weight of what he was about to say. As promised, I'm prepared to offer you a consulting position. Name your price, name your terms. After what you just demonstrated in that room, you've more than earned the right to write your own ticket. Thomas considered the offer, his expression thoughtful but notably not celebratory. Something in his eyes suggested this wasn't the victory Anthony imagined it to be. I appreciate that, Mr. Wright, truly, but I'm not sure a consulting role is what I need right now. Anthony felt confusion flicker across his face. Then a full position, director of engineering, complete creative control, whatever resources you need, whatever team you want to build, this company desperately needs minds like yours, and I'm prepared to do whatever it takes to bring you on board permanently. It's not about the title or the control or even the salary, Thomas explained patiently. It's about addressing the larger issue, the systemic problem that created my situation in the first place and continues to create similar situations for countless others. He leaned forward, his intensity building. The question we should be asking isn't just, how do we hire Thomas Johnson? The question is, how many other brilliant minds are out there right now, overlooked and discarded because of circumstances beyond their control? How many potential innovations are dying on the streets because society has decided that someone's current circumstances define their permanent worth? Thomas pulled several folded papers from his pocket, worn, creased pages covered with precise technical drawings and complex mathematical equations. These are patents I've developed over the past 3 years, he explained, spreading them carefully on the conference table like sacred texts. Sketched on discarded newspapers in the public library, refined during long nights when sleep wouldn't come, solutions to problems your industry hasn't even properly identified yet. Anthony examined the pages with growing astonishment. Each one represented innovation that would be worth millions, potentially billions, in the right hands. Cooling systems for quantum neural networks that would revolutionize artificial intelligence, novel approaches to thermal management in extreme environments, applications for aerospace, computing, energy production, fields Anthony couldn't immediately categorize. These are revolutionary, Anthony breathed, looking up at Thomas with new levels of awe. This cooling system for quantum neural networks alone could transform the entire AI industry. I had a lot of time to think, Thomas said simply. But imagine what could have been developed if I'd had proper resources, a laboratory, a team, access to materials and equipment, and the collaborative environment that breeds innovation. Now multiply that lost potential by all the other talented people being systematically wasted by prejudice and structural barriers. What do you think Thomas is about to propose? Can you see where this is heading? Drop your prediction in the comments. I'm curious what you think happens next. He gathered the papers carefully, treating them with the reverence they deserved. In the shelter where I volunteer teaching science, I've met former medical researchers who developed treatments that saved lives before circumstances destroyed their careers. Software developers who wrote code for platforms you use every day before illness or bad luck rendered them unemployable. Mechanical engineers, electrical engineers, data scientists, brilliant people reduced to invisible poverty not because they lack skills or intelligence or drive, but because society has decided their circumstances disqualify them from opportunity. Anthony felt something fundamental shift in his understanding. A complete reordering of his worldview. This wasn't just about Thomas. This wasn't even just about homelessness or poverty. This was about the catastrophic waste of human potential that happened every single day while people like Anthony, people with power and resources and platforms, remained comfortably ignorant, insulated from consequences by privilege and selective attention. What are you proposing? Anthony asked, though he was beginning to understand. An innovation center, Thomas replied without hesitation, his voice carrying the passion of someone who'd spent 3 years refining this vision in the spaces between survival, not just for technology development, but for talent recovery and human potential realization. A place that identifies overlooked brilliance and provides comprehensive support necessary to nurture it, regardless of background, appearance, housing status, or circumstance. He stood, pacing now, his energy building as he articulated the vision he'd been carrying. A place where a homeless engineer isn't judged by their address, but by their actual expertise and capabilities, where a former researcher who lost everything to medical bankruptcy can contribute their knowledge without shame, where brilliance is recognized and cultivated regardless of whether it arrives in a custom suit or torn jeans, regardless of whether it has a permanent address or sleeps under bridges. "You want me to fund this center?" Anthony asked, though he sensed the answer was more complex. "I want us to build it together," Thomas clarified, his gaze intense and unwavering. "My technical expertise and lived experience of systemic exclusion combined with your resources, industry connections, and platform. These patents alone would fund the initial phase. I'm not asking for charity or handouts. I'm proposing a genuine partnership built on mutual benefit and shared vision for systemic change." He returned to the table, spreading his hands over the patent documents. "You've built an empire by finding talented people, Mr. Wright, but you've been searching in a very small, very privileged pool. Imagine what could be achieved if we expanded that search to include the brilliant minds society has systematically excluded, the innovations we're missing, the solutions to problems we haven't solved, the perspectives we desperately need but have been too blind or too comfortable to recognize." Anthony studied Thomas in absolute silence, processing the audacity and the profound rightness of what he was proposing. This wasn't about redemption for Thomas, though that would be a welcome side effect. This wasn't about Anthony's guilt, though he felt plenty of that now. This was about fundamentally changing a broken system that wasted human potential with devastating efficiency while congratulating itself on being meritocratic. "Not revenge," Anthony said slowly, understanding crystallizing. "Not even just personal redemption. You want systemic change. You want to challenge the fundamental assumptions about worth and potential that created this situation." "Exactly," Thomas confirmed, something like cautious hope flickering in his eyes for the first time since they'd met. "The tragedy isn't that I was homeless for 3 years. The tragedy is that society wasted my potential for 3 years and continues to waste the potential of countless others every single day. We judge people by their circumstances rather than their capabilities. We create systems that exclude the very people who need opportunity most. We tell ourselves it's meritocracy when it's actually just efficient replication of existing privilege and inequality." He spread his hands, a gesture encompassing not just this room, but the entire broken system. "This innovation center wouldn't just recover lost talent. It would challenge fundamental assumptions about worth, about potential, about who deserves opportunity. It would prove that brilliance exists everywhere if we're willing to look beyond our prejudices and comfortable assumptions to find it." Anthony felt the full weight of the decision before him. This wasn't a simple hiring choice or even a business investment. This was a fundamental choice about what kind of person he wanted to be, what kind of company he wanted to build, what kind of world he wanted to help create, what legacy he wanted to leave. Every logical voice in his head, the voice trained by business school, by board meetings, by years of calculated risk assessment and profit optimization, told him this was too ambitious, too idealistic, too likely to fail or create complications. But another voice, quieter but increasingly insistent, reminded him of the brilliant man he'd nearly dismissed that morning, of the innovations he'd almost lost, of the fundamental injustice he'd been complicit in perpetuating through ignorance and indifference and comfortable assumptions about how the world worked. Anthony extended his hand across the table. "Thomas Johnson," he said, his voice steady and certain and committed, "I believe you've just found yourself a partner." The handshake between Anthony Wright and Thomas Johnson lasted only seconds, but its implications would ripple through the tech industry for years to come, touching lives neither man could predict, changing systems that had seemed immutable, proving that one moment of genuine recognition could spark transformation. 6 months later, the Innovation and Talent Recovery Center opened its doors in a renovated building in the industrial district where Anthony's car had broken down, a location Thomas had insisted upon. "This neighborhood knows what it means to be overlooked," Thomas had explained during the planning phases. "It deserves to be part of the transformation, not just a backdrop for other people's success stories." The center's first cohort included 23 people identified through partnerships with shelters, community organizations, and word-of-mouth networks that reached populations traditional recruitment never touched. Former researchers, engineers, programmers, designers, teachers, healthcare workers, People whose circumstances had obscured their capabilities but hadn't diminished them. Within the first 6 months, the center had generated 12 patent applications, developed 6 major innovations for companies including Nexus Innovations, and attracted attention from tech firms worldwide wanting to understand and replicate this radical new approach to talent identification and development. But more importantly, it had restored dignity, purpose, and possibility to 23 people society had systematically written off. It had proven that genius doesn't disappear when circumstances change. It merely becomes invisible to those who aren't willing to look beyond surface appearances. Thomas Johnson, no longer homeless but still deeply passionate about the mission, had become a sought-after speaker on innovation, equity, and the true cost of overlooking brilliance based on circumstances. His story had been featured in every major business publication, not as feel-good inspiration porn, but as serious case study in the economic and social costs of systematic exclusion. But perhaps most importantly, he'd inspired a movement. Tech companies across the industry were rethinking their hiring practices and assumptions. Cities were investing in similar talent recovery programs. The very metrics of success and worth were being questioned, challenged, and slowly transformed. In our world, brilliance appears in unexpected places, often dismissed, overlooked, or discarded based on superficial judgments and systemic bias that we've normalized to the point of invisibility. The true measure of our society isn't found in the success of those already privileged, those born with advantages they did nothing to earn. It's found in our ability to recognize and nurture genius wherever it exists, regardless of circumstances or appearance or zip code. This story isn't just about Thomas and Anthony. It's about every person who's been judged by their circumstances rather than their capabilities. It's about the potential society wastes through prejudice, through comfortable assumptions, through systems designed to replicate existing inequalities. It's about the transformation that becomes possible when someone chooses to see differently, to question their assumptions, to recognize that worth isn't determined by circumstances. It's about you and the potential you may be overlooking in others, or that others may be overlooking in you right now. Thomas's story began with a broken-down car in an industrial district, but it became a movement that challenged an entire industry's assumptions about talent and worth. If his journey moved you, if his resilience inspired you, or if this story challenged the way you see the world and the people around you, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell me, what moment in this story hit you the hardest? Have you ever been in Thomas's position, dismissed because of circumstances beyond your control? Or have you been in Anthony's position, making assumptions about someone based on appearance? What would you do differently after hearing this story? And if you believe stories like this matter, stories that challenge us, inspire us, make us uncomfortable, and force us to confront truths we'd rather ignore, then subscribe to RealTales, hit that like button right now, share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and join our community of people who believe that exposure and truth-telling are the first steps to real transformation. Remember, the next Thomas Johnson might be the person society has taught you to ignore, to fear, to dismiss without a second thought. The next world-changing idea might come from the most unexpected place. Stay alert, stay compassionate, stay open to seeing genius in unexpected packages and uncomfortable places. This isn't the end of Thomas's story, it's just the beginning of what happens when truth meets visibility, when one person chooses to see differently, when we decide that circumstances don't define worth. Subscribe to RealTales because the next story might be yours, or about someone you know, or about a transformation you desperately need to witness. Thank you for watching, for caring, for being part of this community that believes everyone deserves to be seen for who they truly are, not just what their circumstances suggest. Until next time, keep your eyes open, your heart compassionate, and your mind willing to question comfortable assumptions. Brilliance is everywhere if we're brave enough to recognize it.